I weighed my options for learning more about Salk. Trying to become closer to him personally was too risky, because if he was actually the man who killed your grandmother, Rebecca, he would be looking at me closely for any signs that I suspected him. I was never an overly social person to begin with, so suddenly trying to buddy up with him would stand out. And also, I didn't want to be tied any closer to a person that may soon go missing, because even at that early stage, I was resolved that when I was sure who took Rebecca from me, I would kill them. In some ways, my lack of equivocation on that point made things easier to plan, but it also meant I had to be extra careful. For instance, using a private investigator to tail him was out. I couldn't have a third party knowing about my interest in Salk. Not even Daniel Church had his name, and his involvement was a necessary evil. Also, what if the PI saw Salk doing something illegal and called the police? I understand how that sounds, but you need to remember that I had no idea what his motive was if he was the killer. Was it an isolated incident or part of something more? The brutality and the transporting of the body to the field pointed towards someone who had possibly killed before, but the inherent risk in taking someone from the place you work, even in a small and isolated parking lot like that one, made me wonder if he was either an amateur or at least very impulsive. Also, being honest, I didn't want anyone between me and the person that took her away. That left watching him myself. While I was no expert, I knew I would need three basic things: opportunity, ability to observe, and concealment. For opportunity, I slowly shifted my work schedule at the hospital to mirror that of Salk for the most part. This had to be done over the course of a month so I didn't arouse suspicion. Even then, it wasn't perfect, as I would be on call at times and couldn't watch him constantly even in the best of circumstances. Still, I managed to develop a routine of watching him over 40 hours a week, which was the best I could manage myself. As far as ability to observe, I bought the best binoculars and parabolic mic I could afford, along with some tools for getting into places if I needed to. Planning ahead, I also bought a .45 pistol, 5 bundles of rope, and 3 rolls of tape, 2 knives, and a stun gun. I wasn't planning on acting yet, but I wanted to be prepared just in case. Obviously, I had to get these items over time and with cash only. Concealment was simpler but more expensive. I bought 2 older model cars that were cheap, reliable, and common. I had to look at a number of cars before I found 2 that had no distinctive damage, trim, or color combination that also weren't likely to break down on me. I then found 4 places to park them where they wouldn't be towed so long as they didn't stay in one spot more than a few days. As long as I rotated them a couple times a week, everything was fine. I considered disguises, but I saw too many pitfalls. If I got pulled over, it would look suspicious. If Salk saw and recognized me in some getup, I would alert him right away, when coincidence might explain us intersecting otherwise. I also wanted to keep up with any similar killings that might have occurred, and this was before the World Wide Web, so that meant newspapers. I got a dozen subscriptions from roughly a 500-mile radius around and began pouring through them looking for murders and disappearances. By the time everything was in place, 2 months had passed from when I got the DNA results. The first night, I set up down the street from Salk's house. I felt a stir of excitement mixed with my constant sadness and rage. The preparations of the last few weeks had preoccupied my thoughts somewhat, but it had done nothing to ease my sorrow or cool my anger. Sitting in the shadows on that quiet neighborhood street, I strained at every sound and movement like a racehorse waiting for the gate to drop. Just let me have something to confirm what this man had done so I could set to tearing him apart. But of course, nothing happened that first night, or the nights that followed. I would trail him from his home to the store, to the movies, to a coffee shop where a bored girl 20 years younger than him gamely tried to fend off his awkward flirtations. Between the binoculars and the mic, I could see and hear a surprising amount, and as time went on, I got better at positioning myself in the best angles while hopefully staying inconspicuous. 3 weeks in, and I felt like I knew Salk fairly well. He seemed to be a lonely but harmless man that did nothing out of the ordinary. But of course, that was outside Salk. I needed to see what inside Salk looked like. I had explored the exterior of Salk's house one day when I knew he wasn't there a month ago, and the safest place to enter seemed to be the back door. I had ordered a pick set and the same model lock as he had, a cheap 4-pin lock with no security pins. I had actually read a book on lockpicking when I was a kid, but I had been reading more lately in preparation for this. I practiced on the duplicate lock for hours, mainly using a small tension tool at the bottom along with a rake pick to trigger the pins. I knew the real lock would be keyed differently, of course, but with practice I could unlock the dupe in less than 30 seconds. I picked a rare night that he was working and I was not, and then I went to his house. Parking 2 streets over, I cut through backyards quietly, wincing at the bark of a nearby dog. As I crept across his yard and onto his back porch, I had an image of him popping out of the door with a shotgun lowered at my chest. I shook off the thought and crouched down at the door to begin picking. Every scrape of metal sounded enormous in the still night air, and I soaked my shirt with sweat in 2 minutes it took me to open the lock. Without hesitating, I swung open the door and eased inside. The air inside was stale and cool, with the faint smell of cleaning agents and paint the only notable aromas. I was entering through the kitchen, which was very clean but also completely bare. No food, no furniture, not even appliances other than the oven that looked rarely used. I knew the house should be unoccupied, but I still moved quietly and made sure that my small flashlight stayed well below any windows. Moving further into the house, I found empty room after empty room. No furniture or boxes or decorations. And then I reached what I supposed was Salk's bedroom. There was a bare mattress on the floor and a tall standing mirror in one corner. The closet contained a handful of clothes that were the same things I saw him wear every day. I saw something on the mirror and I went back to it. It was a picture of Salk, 10 years younger and 50 pounds lighter. He was at the beach with a woman and they were in some kind of joking volleyball jock pose. He looked like he really was happy in that picture, and it lit his... I heard the front door click and froze. It was unlikely it could be anyone other than him, and regardless, I didn't need to be caught in his house. I went to the second closet in the room, fearing I would find it full with items he regularly used. Thankfully, it was empty, and I eased the door closed moments before he entered. I could see some through the levered closet door, the wooden slats providing little slashes of vision as he moved around. My heart pounded as he opened the other closet and hung up his jacket before changing clothes. I found out later he had asked for a half shift at the last minute, which explained why he was home 6 hours early. Apparently, he had decided to make the most of his evening because he was dressing to go back out. In blue jeans and a t-shirt, he looked almost normal except when you saw his face. It was completely devoid of any expression as he silently moved around the room. After putting on different shoes, he stood in front of the mirror and stared at himself, motionless, for several minutes. His stillness was almost mesmerizing. When he finally moved, I almost jumped. He was reaching for the picture, holding it closer and studying it before studying his own face again. His eyes went back and forth, as a facsimile of the smile in the picture took form on his face. Watching the expression's slow birth across his lips was weirdly grotesque, but worse was the realization that came with it. He was practicing. He was practicing how he should look when he smiled. As I watched Salk study himself in the mirror, I kept waiting for some sign he knew I was there, a glance in my direction or some indication he was preparing for a fight. But there was none. He continued to practice smiling for a few more moments, and then he replaced the photo on the mirror and left the room. When I heard the front door open and shut again, I assumed he'd left, but even after I strained and heard what sounded like his car cranking up and driving off outside, I waited a couple of minutes before easing open the closet door. I was tight with tension, with every creak of the floor sounding like a gunshot in my ears. I crept to the back door, constantly looking around for some sign that Salk had silently doubled back to trick me into thinking he had left. But no, he seemed to truly be gone. Peeking out the back door window, I made my way out to the back porch and across his yard. When I was back to my car, I drove around to his street and Salk's car was gone. I had no way of knowing where he went, but I decided that was okay. While I didn't have definitive evidence that he was a killer yet, the strangeness I had observed that night made the idea a lot more credible. Tired, I went home and tried to get some sleep with little luck. 2 days later, I received one of my distant newspaper deliveries. A 20-year-old girl had gone missing the night I'd been in Salk's house, and he had left for parts unknown. It was nearly 200 miles away from here, but based on the timeline of when she was last seen, he would have had plenty of time to get there if it was him. Even not knowing if he were to blame, I felt terrible. Responsible. If I had done better, been smarter, I could have stopped him already, or at least tracked him, so I would know if he had gone to the girl's town or not. As it was, I was left continuing to observe. That and trying to find more about Marcus Salk from his past. I pulled his file in the admin office at the hospital and found that prior to coming to our town, he had been at a hospital outside of Olathe, Kansas, for a number of years. Not much other information beyond his curriculum vitae, which contained nothing out of the ordinary for an orthopedic surgeon. Still, it gave me a jumping-off point. I called the hospital in Kansas and worked my way to someone in human resources, telling them that I was with a large medical practice in Seattle that was considering extending an offer to a former doctor there, and was checking through his references as part of the potential hiring process. The woman on the phone was friendly from the start, but I could tell there was a brief hesitation and change of tone when I mentioned the person in question was Dr. Salk. Well, I can put you in touch with the chief of staff if you want. He was chief back when Marcus was here too, so he can talk more about what kind of doctor he was, but I shouldn't say anything. Her desire to gossip was almost palpable. I understand, and I'm not trying to put you in a bad spot, but I don't want to make the wrong choice on the guy either, so anything you tell me will be off the record. But it would be a big help if you could give me any insight you have into him. There was a moment of contemplative silence, and she went on. It's just, look, Marcus was a nice guy when he first came here, right? Joked around a lot, patients loved him. He had a sweet wife, and he fit right in. And then him and his wife go on vacation in Europe one summer. This was 6 or 7 years ago now. And when they got back, he was different somehow. Different how? I asked, trying to keep the intense curiosity out of my voice. I was supposed to be a mildly interested businessman, not an obsessed stalker. I could almost hear her shrug over the phone. I don't know how to describe it. He was still nice, and he would joke some, but it all seemed forced. He was off from how he'd been before. Within a few months, he and his wife were divorced, and he'd moved away. I guess he's on the move again. Yeah, we'll see. You've given me a lot of food for thought. Hey, was his wife okay? I mean, did everything turn out okay for her? I could sense her hesitating again, and I was worried I may have pushed for more than she'd give. Luckily, the gossip in her won out as she let out a small sigh. Yes, I guess so, bless her heart. She still lives around here, so I see her from time to time. She doesn't look happy, though. I think Alicia really loved him, and whatever came between them, I think it hurt her a lot. I could feel the rage building in me again as she spoke. Yes, losing someone you love like that, it kind of destroys you. Thank you. Thank you for the help. You've given me a lot to go on. Don't you want to talk to the chief? I gave a small laugh I didn't feel. No, I think I got what I needed right here. Thank you again. When I hung up the phone, I sat with my head in my hands for some time. My thoughts were swimming in the blackness of my mind like pale, blind cave fish. I would catch glimpses of their pallid scales and hear the occasional ripple or splash as they stirred the water, but these ghost impressions left me with little in the way of a solid idea or plan. The things that felt the most real to me were my pain and anger, and it was getting harder to hold them in check. Still, I had to be sure. I took a few days off and drove to Olathe and tried to track down Salk's ex-wife. She wasn't going by her married name any longer, so the phone directory was of little use. I called the Kansas Medical Board and got a residential mailing address that he had never changed. This led me to a nice brick home in a small suburban neighborhood not far from Salk's former hospital. As I went up to the front door, I could see that the paint around the door and shutters was peeling, and the air of disuse and being unoccupied grew so strong as I approached that I felt sure I was knocking on the door of an empty house. But only seconds after I knocked, a woman in her 40s opened the door. She looked at me warily as I fought down the urge to tell her that I knew her. In a way, it was true. She was the girl from Salk's picture. Swallowing, I pushed forward with my story. Hi, ma'am. My name is Peter Elliott. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about your former husband. I tried to smile and seem non-threatening, but I could see her running the mental calculus of the likelihood I was a thief or a rapist. After studying me further, she nodded and stepped aside. Come in, I guess. Is Marcus in some sort of trouble? We stepped into a foyer cluttered with stacks of books and magazines, and as we spoke, she led me down a path to a living room that was even more filled with row after row of books. I gestured around. You've got quite the collection. She had moved a stack of newspapers off of a worn-looking sofa and gestured for me to sit down. She shrugged, looking disconsolate. I think I slipped from being a collector to a hoarder about 2 years ago. I need to clear all this junk out. She looked used up and small in her pale blue bathrobe as she sat down in an old recliner. Her sad eyes looked thoughtfully distant for a moment before coming back to me. So, is he? In trouble? I smiled. I don't know yet, honestly. I'm just looking into him for an interested party, and my understanding is that you two were together for many years. A brief look of pain crossed her face. Yeah, we were. Childhood sweethearts, if you can believe that. I thought we'd always be together. I leaned forward. If you don't feel it's too personal, can you tell me what changed? Did Marcus change? She picked at some dried skin on her lip nervously. She suddenly seemed very uncertain. Fuck it. Yes, he did. He changed all of a sudden. Do you know when or why? She nodded, her eyes focusing on me as anger lit the edges of her face. I know exactly when. We had just come back from a trip to Europe. Something we'd wanted to do since high school. Had a great time, too. We landed in Atlanta and were waiting for our connecting flight to Topeka. That's when he got sick. Got sick? Sick how? She shook her head. I don't know. He had gone to the bathroom near the terminal, and when he came back, he said he didn't feel well. His head and neck were hurting a lot. He felt nauseous. By the time we landed in Kansas, he said it had passed, but... She sighed. This is pointless. You won't believe anything I'm going to tell you anyway. I grimaced slightly. I will. Please, I can't go into detail, but this is very important, and I'll listen to anything you tell me with an open mind. She looked at me for several moments, again weighing. Finally, she nodded and went on. He was different from then on. At first I thought he was still sick or jet-lagged, but then I thought he was stressed or having a midlife crisis. But those were all just excuses, really. Because I was thinking it from the night we got home from the airport. Thinking what? That it wasn't Marcus anymore. She held up a hand. I know how that sounds, believe me, but I knew that man. I had known him and loved him since I was 10. It was like whatever happened between us landing in Atlanta and taking back off, it swallowed him up. He still sounded like Marcus, and I could see him trying to act like him, but it was wrong somehow. False. It felt like someone who knew a lot about Marcus was trying to impersonate him. She gave a harsh laugh. I swear to God, he even smelled different. I told my mother that, and she set me up with a therapist right away. I didn't know what to do with all this. What she was saying was incredible in the literal sense of the word, but I found myself believing her. Even if she was wrong, I didn't think she was lying to me. So, what are you saying? You don't think it was him anymore. What does that mean? I don't know. Believe me, I've spent years wondering about it, and I still don't know the answer. But something changed, and not in the normal, oh, people change way. He wasn't right. I would see him sometimes when he didn't know I was around, and he was entirely different. His face would be slack. His eyes were dead. He looked like some kind of terrible doll. I thought about my night in the closet and suppressed a shudder. Was he ever violent or abusive towards you? She shook her head. No, never. Never said a harsh word to me. Actually had less of a temper than he had before, but he'd always been sweet back when he was himself too. She rubbed at her eyes for a moment before continuing. But it didn't matter. I tried talking to him about it at first. I tried to see if I could help. But when I finally accepted that it wasn't him anymore, I found myself just getting more and more withdrawn. More and more afraid of him. What made you afraid of him? She stood up, jamming her hands in the pockets of her robe as she began to pace around the open patches of floor in the room. You ever been to an aquarium with sharks? I nodded. You know how they'll swim by, looking at you all calm and placid, but you know that behind that black eye, they aren't calm or placid. They're just not ready to eat yet, and they know there's glass in the way. That's the way I came to feel when Marcus was here. He would glide around me silently in the mornings and at night, his eyes seeing and not seeing me at the same time. And he was always calm, always grinning his fake shark grin. Maybe it was my imagination, but I felt like whatever hunger he had, it was growing. And the glass holding him back was getting thinner. I realized I'd been holding my breath, and I let it out. So you divorced him. She gave a small, sad smile, and she sat back down. Yes, it was very easy. I told him I wanted a divorce, and he said that sounded just fine, and he moved out the same day. Aside from signing papers in a lawyer's office, I never saw him again. Okay, but why did you stay here, in the same house? Weren't you worried he might come back? Her smile grew slightly. Well, that's the thing, isn't it? On the one hand, yes, I'm scared of seeing Marcus showing back up one day. But what if it was the real Marcus that came back? What if I'd moved, changed my name to make sure he couldn't find me, and then it was the real Marcus, somehow back as randomly as he was taken away, and he came looking for me? What if he couldn't find me? Her voice grew thick at the end, and I reached out to grasp her shoulder. I didn't have any real words of comfort or wisdom to give her, and being around her pain just reminded me of my own. Standing, I looked down at the girl that had once been Alicia Salk. It made me hate Marcus even more to see what he had done to her. I don't have any easy answers for you, Alicia. I don't think that Marcus, your Marcus, is coming back. I don't know if that helps or hurts you, but maybe it will make it easier for you to move on. She looked up, her expression bitter. It doesn't help. And I know you mean well, but I'd like you to leave. I nodded and headed outside. I turned to say goodbye, but the door was already closed behind me. When I got back home the following morning, I found a follow-up article on the missing girl. She had been found behind a middle school a few miles away from where she was abducted, and she had been torn apart.